Hey guys, tonight we begin with the grim, dangerous and not so glamorous world of ancient Chinese assassins. Tonight we're diving into the shadows of ancient China, where assassins weren't cool martial arts masters, but desperate people with terrible job security. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together as we explore some truly unglamorous chapters of history that Hollywood definitely didn't get right. Let's start with a truth that might surprise you. When you think of Chinese assassins, you probably picture elegant warriors in flowing robes, masters of hidden weapons, and ancient martial arts. The reality? Most Chinese assassins throughout history were broke, desperate, and had about as much honour as a street thief with good aim. The profession of assassination in ancient China wasn't a noble calling. It was what happened when every other door in life had slammed shut. Unlike the romanticised ninja of Japan or the mythical assassin of the Middle East, Chinese assassins were typically recruited from the dregs of society. Criminals, debtors, disgraced soldiers, and people so far outside the social order that killing someone important might actually improve their status. The Chinese had a saying, "A hero does not become a dog does not become a hero." But assassins? They weren't heroes or dogs, they were shadows, existing in the spaces between honour and survival. Take the Warring States period, roughly 7th to 3rd centuries, BCE. This was supposedly the golden age of Chinese assassination, when kings and nobles hired killers, like other people hired cooks. But even then, being an assassin meant accepting that you were essentially a disposable tool. You weren't building a career, you were signing a death warrant with your own name on it. The most famous Chinese assassin of this era was Jing Kai, who attempted to kill the future first emperor in 227 BCE. His story has been romanticised in countless retellings, but the reality was messier. Jing Kai was a failed scholar, a drunk, and a man so desperate for relevance that he accepted what was essentially a suicide mission. He failed spectacularly, and his death accomplished nothing except giving future storytellers material for tragic poems. But let's talk about the day-to-day reality of being a Chinese assassin, because that's where the real misery lived. First, there was the training, or rather, the lack of it. Unlike the elaborate martial arts schools depicted in movies, most Chinese assassins learned their trade through trial and error, with heavy emphasis on error. If you were lucky, you might find an older assassin willing to teach you the basics: how to move quietly, how to identify escape routes, how to kill quickly. But more often, you learned by watching others fail and trying not to repeat their mistakes. The weapons were practical, not elegant. Forget about hidden blades that shot out of your sleeves, or throwing stars that could cut through armour. You carried whatever you could conceal and afford. A short blade, maybe some poison if you knew someone who knew someone. Often, your primary weapon was timing and desperation. Poison was particularly unreliable in ancient China. Unlike the precise formulations you see in fiction, most poisons were herbal concoctions with unpredictable effects. Too little, and your target would just get sick and suspicious. Too much, and you might accidentally poison yourself while preparing it. There were no safety protocols, no standardised dosages, just folk knowledge passed down through whispers and trial runs on animals. The pay was another cruel joke. Clients promised fortunes, but payment was always contingent on success. And success meant not just killing your target, but escaping afterward to collect your fee. Given that most assassination attempts ended with the assassin's death, the actual payment rate was approximately 0. Even worse, clients had a nasty habit of eliminating their hired killers after the job was done. Dead assassins couldn't blackmail anyone, couldn't reveal who hired them, and didn't expect payment. From a purely business perspective, killing your assassin was just good risk management. The social isolation was crushing. You couldn't maintain relationships because everyone you met was either a potential client, a potential target, or a potential threat. You couldn't trust other assassins because they might sell you out for a better contract. You couldn't retire because retired assassins were just former killers with dangerous knowledge. And let's talk about the missions themselves. You weren't hired to kill corrupt officials or evil tyrants. You were hired to eliminate whoever your client found inconvenient. A business rival, a political opponent, sometimes just someone who had insulted them at a party. The moral weight of these assignments would crush most people, but assassins learn to compartmentalize or go mad. The actual assassination attempts were usually clumsy affairs, no elaborate schemes or perfect timing. You'd wait for days in uncomfortable hiding spots, living on scraps, watching your target's routine. When the moment came, you'd strike quickly and hope for the best. If you succeeded, you'd run. If you failed, you'd die badly. Palace assassinations were the worst assignments. Palaces were designed specifically to prevent unauthorized killing. Multiple guard rotations, food tasters, body doubles, secret passages known only to loyalists. Getting close to an emperor or high noble required bribing dozens of people, any of whom might sell you out for a better offer. The famous assassination attempt on Emperor Wu of Han in 91 BCE involved an assassin who spent 3 years working as a palace servant just to get close to his target. When the moment came, his nerve failed, and he was executed along with his entire family. 3 years of planning, hundreds of lives lost, and the emperor didn't even get a scratch. Even successful assassins rarely lived to enjoy their victory. The case of Zhuanzhu, who killed King Liao of Wu in 515 BCE, is instructive. Zhuanzhu managed to conceal a dagger inside a fish during a state banquet and successfully killed the king. But he was immediately cut down by guards, and his family was executed to prevent blood feuds. The psychological toll was immense. Killing people, even terrible people, changes you. Chinese assassins often turn to alcohol, opium, or religious extremism to cope with their guilt and isolation. Many developed what we'd now recognise as severe PTSD, jumping at shadows and trusting no one. There was no retirement plan for assassins, no pension, no peaceful cottage in the countryside. You worked until you died, and you died badly. The lucky ones were killed quickly during a mission. The unlucky ones lived long enough to be captured, tortured for information about their clients, and then executed publicly as examples. Some tried to escape the profession by fleeing to distant provinces or even foreign countries, but reputation followed you in ancient China. Word travelled along trade routes and diplomatic channels. A known assassin could never truly disappear, never truly be safe. The irony is that despite their fearsome reputation, most Chinese assassins were cowards. They had to be. Brave people became soldiers or rebels. Assassins were the ones who chose murder over honest death, who picked individual targets instead of fighting an open battle. They were survivors, not heroes, and survival required constant compromise with honour. The families of assassins suffered terribly. Guilt by association was a real thing in ancient China. If you were related to a known killer, you might find yourself exiled, imprisoned, or worse. Children of assassins often grew up in poverty and shame, sometimes following their parents into the same dark profession out of sheer desperation. And for all their skill at death, Chinese assassins were remarkably bad at politics. They understood how to kill individuals, but not how to change systems. Removing one corrupt official just made room for another. Killing a tyrant often led to civil war and more suffering. They were tactical tools in strategic games they rarely understood. The rise of the imperial examination system during the Tang dynasty actually made things worse for potential assassins. Now there was a legitimate path to power and influence, through scholarship and service. Anyone smart enough to be an effective assassin was probably smart enough to pass the exams and build a real career. This left the assassination business to the truly desperate and incompetent. By the Song dynasty, professional assassination had largely disappeared from Chinese courts, replaced by more sophisticated forms of political maneuvering. The few assassins who remained were crude killers for hire, more likely to be involved in merchant disputes than palace intrigue. So no, being a Chinese assassin throughout history was not an exciting life of adventure and martial arts mastery. It was a desperate profession for desperate people, offering nothing but isolation, guilt, and an early grave. The shadows weren't mysterious and romantic. They were just dark, cold places where broken people went to break others. Now let's shift from the shadows of ancient China to the sun-baked horror of Roman galley ships, where being a slave rower meant trading your humanity for the privilege of dying slowly in chains. Hollywood loves to show galley slaves as noble prisoners, chained heroes who eventually break free and seek revenge. The reality was far more disturbing. Roman galley slaves weren't captured kings or fallen warriors. They were human machinery, living engines of war and commerce, who were worked to death in conditions that would make modern prison wardens quit their jobs. The Roman Empire ran on slavery, but galley slavery was special in its calculated cruelty. While household slaves might live relatively comfortable lives and even earn their freedom, galley slaves were purchased specifically to die. No one expected them to survive more than a few years, and the system was designed around their rapid replacement. Let's start with how you became a galley slave. Pirates and raiders would sweep through coastal villages, chaining anyone strong enough to pull an oar. Prisoners of war, debtors, criminals, and sometimes just people in the wrong place at the wrong time, found themselves naked, shackled, and heading for the docks. Age didn't matter much. If you could grip an oar, you were valuable cargo. The initial journey to the galleys was often a death march. Chained slaves were force-marched hundreds of miles to ports, fed barely enough to keep them alive. Many died before they ever saw a ship. The survivors were branded, their heads shaved, and they were sold in batches like cattle. Once aboard, the real nightmare began. Galley slaves were chained to their benches for months at a time. A typical Roman trireme carried about 170 rowers, arranged in 3 tiers. Each man had roughly 3 feet of space, shared with the oar that would become his entire world. You didn't have a bed, you didn't have privacy. You had a bench, a chain, and an oar. The chains weren't just symbolic, they were practical tools of control. Each slave wore iron shackles around his ankles, connected to a long chain that ran the length of the ship. This chain was secured at both ends, meaning the entire rowing section moved as one unit. If one man tried to escape, he'd drag dozens of others with him. If one man died, the others had to row with a corpse until the ship reached port. Sanitation was non-existent. Slaves relieved themselves where they sat. The bilge water that sloshed around their feet was a mixture of seawater, urine, feces, vomit, and rotting food. Diseases spread through the rowing decks like wildfire. Dysentery, typhus, and scurvy killed more galley slaves than enemy action ever did. The work was literally back-breaking. Roman galleys were propelled by synchronized rowing, with slaves pulling massive oars in rhythm for hours at a time. The stroke rate during battle could reach 40 strokes per minute, sustained for hours. Your muscles would scream, your hands would bleed, your back would spasm, but the whip would keep you moving. Speaking of whips, discipline on Roman galleys was absolute and brutal. Each rowing section was overseen by a hortator, a slave driver whose job was to maintain the rhythm and pace. They carried lead-tipped whips and used them liberally. Too slow and you were whipped. Out of rhythm and you were whipped. Showed signs of exhaustion and you were whipped harder. The food was designed to keep you alive, not healthy. A typical ration consisted of a biscuit of coarse grain, sometimes softened with seawater, and whatever scraps the crew decided to throw down to the rowing deck. Meat was rare, fresh vegetables non-existent. Most galley slaves suffered from malnutrition, even when food was plentiful. Water was strictly rationed and often foul. Each slave received about a pint per day, sometimes less during long voyages. The water was stored in wooden casks that quickly developed algae and bacteria. Drinking it was necessary for survival, but it often caused stomach ailments that made the already miserable conditions unbearable. Sleep was torture. Slaves slept chained to their benches, often while the ship was still moving. The constant motion, the noise of water against the hull, the groans and cries of other slaves made rest nearly impossible. Many slaves developed chronic insomnia, which affected their rowing performance, which led to more beatings. Medical care was purely practical. If a slave was injured but could still row, he was given basic treatment to keep him functional. If his injury was serious enough to affect his performance, he was either thrown overboard or sold at the next port for whatever someone would pay for damaged goods. The psychological damage was perhaps worse than the physical abuse. Many slaves went mad within months. Some withdrew into catatonic states, rowing mechanically while their minds simply shut down. Others became violent, lashing out at fellow slaves or guards. The smart ones learned to become invisible, to row efficiently without drawing attention, to survive one day at a time without thinking about tomorrow. Escape was virtually impossible. Even if you could break your chains and fight your way to the deck, you were in the middle of the ocean with nowhere to go. Ships' crews were specifically trained to prevent slave uprisings, and the penalties for attempted escape were creative in their cruelty. Crucifixion was common, but some captains preferred to keel-haul escapees or simply feed them to sharks, while the other slaves watched. The famous slave revolt led by Spartacus never included galley slaves, and for good reason. They were too broken, too isolated, and too dependent on their captors for basic survival to organise effective resistance. Land-based slaves could run away, hide in forests, or join rebel groups. Galley slaves could only row. Death rates were staggering. Most galley slaves died within 2 to 3 years. Some lasted longer, developing the mechanical rhythm and emotional numbness necessary for survival. These veterans were actually valuable since they could teach new slaves the basics and help maintain efficiency, but even they rarely lived beyond 5 years. When slaves did die, their bodies were simply thrown overboard. No ceremony, no record, no acknowledgement that a human being had perished. The chain would be shortened by one link. The remaining slaves would close ranks and rowing would continue. Death was so common that it barely interrupted the ship's routine. The treatment varied slightly, depending on the ship's purpose. Military galleys during wartime were the worst assignments. Speed was everything, and slaves were pushed far beyond their physical limits. Merchant vessels were marginally better, with slightly more predictable schedules and less urgent pace requirements. But better was relative when you were still chained to a bench and fed scraps. Some historians argue that galley slavery wasn't as bad as other forms of bondage because it required skilled labour. This is nonsense. Rowing a galley required strength and endurance, not skill. Any healthy person could learn the basics in a few days. The high turnover rate proves that these weren't valued craftsmen, but disposable human engines. The economics of galley slavery were based entirely on replacement costs. Slaves were cheap enough that working them to death was more profitable than keeping them healthy. A galley slave might cost 200 denarii, but could power thousands of miles of travel before wearing out. From a purely financial perspective, they were excellent investments. Female slaves were rarely used as galley rowers, not out of mercy, but because upper body strength was the primary requirement. Women who ended up on ships were usually assigned to other duties, or sold as entertainment for the crew. Neither option was preferable to rowing. Children weren't spared from galley service, but they were usually assigned to lighter duties until they grew strong enough to handle full-sized oars. Child slaves might serve as messengers, food distributors, or assistants to the rowing masters. These positions offered slightly better survival rates, but childhood on a Roman galley meant watching hundreds of adults die while knowing your turn was coming. The psychological techniques used to break galley slaves were sophisticated for their time. New slaves were often forced to watch experienced rowers being punished for minor infractions. They were deliberately mixed with slaves from different regions and cultures to prevent communication and cooperation. Some captains would randomly select slaves for rewards or punishments, creating an atmosphere of unpredictable terror. Religious practices were generally forbidden among galley slaves, not because Romans opposed other religions, but because group activities could foster solidarity and resistance. Slaves caught praying together or performing rituals were severely punished. This spiritual isolation added another layer of suffering to an already unbearable existence. The end of galley slavery came not from humanitarian concerns, but from technological advancements. As Roman shipbuilding improved and sailing techniques became more sophisticated, wind-powered vessels became more efficient than human-powered ones. Slaves weren't freed because Romans developed consciences. They were simply replaced by better technology. Even then, the transition was gradual. Some Roman galleys continued using slave rowers well into the imperial period, particularly for military applications, where speed and maneuverability were crucial. The last documented use of galley slaves in the Roman military was during the Byzantine period, centuries after the fall of the Western Empire. So when you imagine Roman galley slaves, forget the Hollywood images of noble prisoners plotting heroic escapes. Think, instead, of broken humans, reduced to mechanical functions, dying anonymously in chains while their lives measured in strokes per minute until their hearts simply stopped beating. Let's leave the Mediterranean and travel to medieval Europe, where alchemists spent their lives transforming not lead into gold, but their own health into chronic poisoning, poverty, and social persecution. Modern popular culture has given us a romantic image of medieval alchemists as wise scholars in tower laboratories, mixing bubbling potions and unlocking the secrets of nature. The reality was far more pathetic. Most alchemists were desperate men, often failed physicians or scholars, who spent their lives inhaling toxic fumes while pursuing impossible goals with equipment that barely qualified as sophisticated cookware. Alchemy in medieval Europe wasn't a legitimate science. It was a combination of primitive chemistry, superstition, and wishful thinking practiced by people who were usually one step ahead of accusations of heresy or fraud. The few alchemists who achieved anything resembling success did so by accidentally discovering useful chemical processes while trying to accomplish something completely different. Let's start with the workspace. The typical alchemist's laboratory wasn't a grand tower room with gleaming equipment. It was usually a cramped, poorly ventilated space in a basement or shed, filled with crude furnaces, clay pots, and glass vessels that broke constantly. The air was thick with smoke from charcoal fires, metallic vapours from heating metals, and the stench of sulphur, mercury, and other chemicals. These laboratories were death traps. Mercury poisoning was so common among alchemists that the symptoms were considered occupational hazards. Tremors, memory loss, personality changes, and eventual madness were just the price of doing business. Many alchemists spent their final years as nervous wrecks, unable to hold steady hands or think clearly, still mixing potions with shaking fingers. Lead poisoning was even more common. Alchemists worked with lead compounds constantly, often without any understanding of their toxicity. They would heat lead, inhale lead vapours, and sometimes even taste their preparations to test their properties. The chronic lead exposure caused anemia, kidney damage, neurological problems, and shortened lifespans significantly. The equipment was primitive and dangerous. Furnaces were simple charcoal or wood-burning affairs that frequently exploded or caught fire. Glass vessels were handmade and fragile, shattering without warning and often causing serious cuts. Alchemists regularly suffered burns from handling hot metals and chemicals without proper protection. The materials they worked with were expensive and often impossible to obtain. Mercury, sulfur, antimony, and various metallic ores had to be purchased from merchants who charged enormous prices for substances of questionable purity. Many alchemists went bankrupt buying materials for experiments that were doomed to fail. Funding was a constant nightmare. Unlike modern scientists with research grants, medieval alchemists had to support themselves while pursuing their studies. Some worked as physicians, apothecaries, or craftsmen during the day and conducted experiments at night. Others depended on wealthy patrons who expected quick results and impossible achievements. The relationship with patrons was particularly toxic. Wealthy nobles and merchants would fund alchemists with the expectation that they would produce gold, discover the elixir of life, or create military weapons. When these impossible goals weren't achieved, patrons often accused their alchemists of fraud or incompetence. Some alchemists were imprisoned or executed for failing to deliver on promises they never should have made. Roger Bacon, one of the most famous medieval scholars associated with alchemy, spent years in prison, partly because his investigations were considered suspiciously close to sorcery. The line between alchemy and forbidden magic was thin and constantly shifting, depending on political and religious circumstances. The social isolation was crushing. Legitimate scholars often viewed alchemists as deluded charlatans. Religious authorities suspected them of trafficking with demons. Common people feared them as potential sorcerers. Even other alchemists were competitors rather than colleagues, jealously guarding their secrets and methods. The secrecy required for survival made scientific progress nearly impossible. Alchemists wrote in codes, used invented languages, and deliberately obscured their methods to protect themselves from persecution. This meant that useful discoveries were often lost when their creators died, and the same failed experiments were repeated countless times by different practitioners. The psychological toll was enormous. Imagine spending decades of your life pursuing goals that modern science knows are impossible. The transmutation of base metals into gold violates fundamental laws of chemistry. The universal solvent would dissolve any container you put it in. The elixir of life contradicts basic biology. But medieval alchemists didn't know these things were impossible, so they kept trying, failing, and wondering what they were doing wrong. Many alchemists developed obsessive-compulsive behaviours, repeating the same failed experiments with tiny variations, convinced that the next attempt would finally succeed. They would spend months perfecting what they believed was the ideal temperature, the perfect timing, or the correct sequence of operations, only to produce the same worthless residue they'd been creating for years. Depression and alcoholism were common among alchemists. The constant failure, social isolation, and chronic ill health took a severe psychological toll. Many turned to alcohol or other substances to cope with their frustration and despair. Ironically, some of their most interesting chemical discoveries came from attempts to distill better alcohol. The relationship with the church was complex and dangerous. Some church authorities tolerated alchemy as natural philosophy, while others condemned it as sorcery. The same alchemist might be protected by one bishop and persecuted by another. This uncertainty meant that alchemists lived in constant fear of sudden accusation and trial. Women who practiced alchemy faced even worse persecution. they were more likely to be accused of witchcraft and faced harsher penalties for the same activities that men might survive. Female alchemists often had to work in complete secrecy, which limited their access to materials and made collaboration impossible. The literature of alchemy was deliberately confusing and contradictory. Alchemical texts were written in symbolic language designed to hide practical methods from the uninitiated. But this obfuscation often meant that even dedicated practitioners couldn't understand what previous alchemists had actually done. Recipes called for the blood of the green lion or the tears of Mercury without explaining what these terms actually meant. Equipment failure was constant and expensive. Furnaces would crack from thermal stress, glass vessels would shatter from chemical reactions, and metal tools would corrode from exposure to acids. An alchemist might spend months saving money to buy a new crucible, only to have it destroyed in the first experiment. The physical demands were severe. Alchemists worked long hours in hot, poorly ventilated spaces, manually operating bellows to maintain furnace temperatures, grinding materials by hand, and standing over toxic vapours for hours at a time. Many developed respiratory problems, back injuries, and repetitive stress disorders. Food contamination was a serious risk. Alchemists often worked and lived in the same space, meaning that toxic chemicals could contaminate their food and water. Mercury contamination was particularly dangerous because it's absorbed through the skin and accumulates in body tissues over time. The economics were brutal. Most alchemical experiments consumed expensive materials while producing worthless results. A successful alchemist might spend years breaking even, while an unsuccessful one faced bankruptcy and starvation. The few who achieved any financial success usually did so by selling medicines or chemicals to other practitioners, not by achieving their theoretical goals. Professional rivalry was vicious. Alchemists would steal each other's materials, sabotage experiments, and spread rumours about competitors being heretics or frauds. Since the field attracted desperate and unstable individuals, violence was not uncommon. Some alchemists carried weapons and hired bodyguards to protect their laboratories. The apprenticeship system was exploitative. Young men who wanted to learn alchemy often became unpaid servants, performing dangerous tasks while learning little of actual value. Masters had no incentive to fully train apprentices who might become competitors, so they kept the most important secrets to themselves. Legal troubles were frequent. Alchemists were often accused of counterfeiting when they attempted to transmute metals. Even unsuccessful attempts could result in charges of fraud or conspiracy. Some jurisdictions banned alchemical practice entirely, forcing practitioners to work as outlaws. The irony is that alchemy did eventually contribute to the development of chemistry, but not in the way its practitioners intended. The equipment, techniques, and accumulated knowledge of failed alchemists provided the foundation for legitimate chemical research. But individual alchemists rarely lived to see any practical benefits from their work. By the Renaissance, educated people increasingly recognized alchemy as a dead end. The rise of experimental science, better understanding of chemical principles, and more rigorous methods of investigation made traditional alchemy obsolete. The last serious alchemists were regarded as relics of a more superstitious age. So when you imagine medieval alchemists, don't picture wise wizards unlocking cosmic secrets. Picture desperate men in smoky basements, slowly poisoning themselves while chasing impossible dreams, dying broke and forgotten while accidentally laying the groundwork for sciences they would never understand. Now let's ride across the steppes to explore another profession that looks glamorous from a distance, but was actually a nightmare of constant warfare, extreme hardship, and early death. Being a Mongol horse archer. Popular culture presents Mongol warriors as unstoppable masters of mounted warfare, noble nomads who conquered the largest land empire in human history through superior tactics and horsemanship. The reality was that being a Mongol horse archer meant spending your entire life in the saddle, sleeping on frozen ground, eating rancid meat, and dying far from home in service to Khans who viewed you as expendable ammunition. Let's start with the horses because Mongol warfare was built entirely around them. Each warrior maintained a string of at least 3 horses, often more. These weren't magnificent war steeds, but small, hardy ponies adapted to steppe conditions. They were tough, sure-footed, and could survive on grass and snow, but they were also mean-tempered, uncomfortable to ride for long periods, and required constant care. The relationship between Mongol and horse wasn't romantic. It was purely practical. Horses were tools, transportation, food sources, and sometimes the difference between life and death. A Mongol warrior spent more time caring for horses than fighting enemies. Feeding them, grooming them, treating their injuries and protecting them from wolves and thieves was a full-time job that never ended. Riding for 12 to 16 hours a day was normal during campaigns. Your legs would go numb, your back would ache constantly, and the inside of your thighs would be raw and bleeding from the constant friction. Mongol saddles were designed for durability, not comfort. They were hard wooden frames covered with felt, built to last for years of hard use, but offering minimal cushioning for the rider. The climate of the Central Asian steppes was hostile to human life. Winters were brutally cold, with temperatures dropping far below zero and winds that could strip flesh from bone. Summers were scorching hot during the day and surprisingly cold at night. There was little shelter on the open grasslands, so Mongol warriors lived at the mercy of weather that could kill them in hours. Clothing was purely functional. Mongol warriors wore layers of felt, leather, and fur that could protect them from weather and weapons, but were heavy, uncomfortable, and rarely clean. The famous Mongol deel, or traditional robe, was practical for horseback riding, but provided little protection against the elements. In winter, warriors wrapped themselves in so many layers that they could barely move, but it was still never enough. Food was whatever you could find, catch, or steal. The Mongol diet consisted primarily of dairy products, horse meat, and occasionally grain, when it could be obtained from conquered territories. Fresh vegetables were almost unknown. Milk, fermented mare's milk called airag, and dried meats were staples, but all of these could spoil or become contaminated, causing severe illness. Hunting was a necessity, not a sport. Mongol warriors spent much of their time hunting game to supplement their rations. This meant tracking animals across vast distances, often in harsh weather, while maintaining their equipment and caring for their horses. A failed hunt could mean starvation for an entire unit. The famous Mongol composite bow was a marvel of engineering, but it was also a high-maintenance weapon that required constant care. The bow was made from layers of horn, wood, and sinew that had to be kept dry and properly tensioned. In humid climates, bows would lose their power and accuracy. In extreme cold, they could become brittle and snap. Bowstrings made from silk or sinew would stretch, break, or become useless when wet. Arrows were precious resources that had to be carefully conserved. Each warrior carried 2 or 3 quivers, holding about 60 arrows total. Once these were exhausted in battle, the warrior had to recover arrows from the battlefield, make new ones from available materials, or become useless as a ranged fighter. Arrow making required specific materials and considerable skill that not all warriors possessed. The physical demands of horse archery were extreme. Drawing a Mongol bow required tremendous upper body strength, and doing it repeatedly while controlling a moving horse demanded perfect coordination and balance. Warriors developed specific muscular adaptations, but they also suffered from repetitive stress injuries, shoulder problems, and chronic pain from the constant strain. Training began in early childhood and never ended. Mongol boys started riding before they could walk properly and began archery training as soon as they could hold a bow. But this early start came at a cost. Childhood injuries were common and often permanently disabling. Many potential warriors were eliminated by training accidents before they ever saw battle. The military organisation was brutal in its efficiency. Mongol armies were organised on a decimal system with units of 10, 100, 1,000 and 10,000 warriors. Discipline was absolute. If one man in a unit of 10 fled from battle, all 10 were executed. If one unit of 10 fled, the entire unit of 100 was executed. This system ensured loyalty through terror rather than honour. Combat was terrifying even for the victors. Mongol tactics emphasised mobility, speed, and psychological warfare. Warriors would ride at full gallop toward enemy formations, loose volleys of arrows, and retreat before the enemy could respond. This required incredible nerve and skill, but it was also exhausting and dangerous. Horses could stumble, arrows could misfire, and enemies could get lucky shots. The famous Mongol feigned retreat was a complex manoeuvre that could easily go wrong. Warriors would pretend to flee in panic, drawing enemy forces into pursuit, then turn and attack the scattered pursuers. But if the timing was wrong or communications failed, the fake retreat could become a real rout. Many Mongol warriors died because they couldn't tell the difference between a planned withdrawal and actual defeat. Siege warfare was particularly brutal for horse archers. Mongols were most effective in open terrain, where their mobility was an advantage. When besieging cities, they had to fight on foot with unfamiliar tactics, while their horses became liabilities that needed food and protection. Many horse archers died in siege operations they were poorly trained for. The treatment of prisoners varied depending on strategic needs, but Mongol warriors were taught to show no mercy. This meant that they regularly participated in mass executions, deportations, and other atrocities that would traumatize even hardened soldiers. The psychological cost of constant brutality was severe, leading to alcohol abuse, violence, and mental breakdown among warriors. Disease was a constant threat. Living in close contact with horses, drinking contaminated water, and eating questionable food led to frequent outbreaks of dysentery, typhus, and other infections. Medical care was primitive, consisting mainly of folk remedies and fermented mare's milk. Wounded warriors often died from infections that modern medicine could easily treat. The logistics of Mongol campaigns were nightmarish. Armies moved with massive herds of horses, cattle, and sheep that required constant grazing. Finding adequate pasture for thousands of animals while maintaining military formation was almost impossible. Herds would scatter, animals would die, and warriors would spend more time looking for lost livestock than fighting enemies. Navigation across the featureless steppes required specialised knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death. Mongol warriors learned to read subtle environmental cues, track celestial movements, and interpret weather patterns. Getting lost meant starvation, freezing, or wandering into enemy territory. Even experienced warriors could become disoriented during storms or in unfamiliar terrain. The social hierarchy was rigid and unforgiving. Common warriors had no voice in strategic decisions and could be sacrificed without consultation. Promotion was possible, but required surviving numerous campaigns, demonstrating exceptional skill and maintaining the favour of superior officers who might change their minds arbitrarily. Family separation was the norm during campaigns. Warriors might be away from their families for years at a time, missing births, deaths, and important ceremonies. Many returned home to find their wives had died, their children had grown up without them, or their tribal groups had moved to different territories. The famous Mongol tolerance for different religions and cultures was largely practical rather than humanitarian. Mongols adopted local customs when it served their purposes and abandoned them just as quickly. Warriors were expected to adapt to whatever religious or cultural practices their commanders deemed useful, regardless of their personal beliefs. Retirement was virtually unknown. Mongol warriors fought until they were killed, too injured to continue, or too old to ride effectively. There was no pension system, no veteran benefits, and no social support for disabled warriors. Men who could no longer fight became burdens on their families, or died in poverty. The empire's vast size meant that many warriors died thousands of miles from home, in climates and terrain completely different from the steppes they knew. Mongol warriors who started their careers raiding Chinese border towns might end their lives fighting in the forests of Eastern Europe or the deserts of the Middle East, never seeing their homeland again. The psychological isolation was profound. These men were cut off from their traditional support systems, fighting in foreign lands among people whose languages they couldn't speak and whose customs they didn't understand. The only constants were violence, hardship, and the company of other warriors who were just as displaced and traumatized as they were. Alcoholism was rampant among Mongol warriors. Fermented mare's milk was a traditional drink, but many warriors escalated to stronger alcohol when it was available from conquered territories. Drinking was one of the few escapes from the constant stress, pain, and horror of their lives. Drunk warriors were unreliable in battle, prone to accidents, and often violent toward their comrades. The famous Mongol religious tolerance didn't extend to their own spiritual needs. Warriors were expected to participate in whatever religious ceremonies their commanders deemed politically useful, regardless of their personal beliefs. This meant attending Christian masses, Islamic prayers, and Buddhist rituals while maintaining their traditional shamanic practices in secret. Equipment maintenance was a never-ending chore that could mean the difference between life and death. Mongol warriors had to constantly repair their bows, arrows, saddles, and armour using whatever materials they could find. A broken bowstring or cracked arrow shaft could leave a warrior defenceless in the middle of a campaign. Many warriors spent their evenings working by firelight, trying to patch equipment with inadequate tools and materials. The weather wasn't just uncomfortable, it was actively hostile. Mongol campaigns took place in all seasons and all climates. Warriors who were adapted to the dry cold of the steppes found themselves fighting in tropical jungles, humid river valleys, and sandy deserts. Heat stroke, frostbite, and exposure killed more warriors than enemy weapons in many campaigns. Communications across the vast Mongol Empire were primitive and unreliable. Messages could take months to travel from one end of the empire to the other, assuming they arrived at all. Warriors often operated without clear orders, uncertain whether their commanders were alive or dead, whether the war they were fighting was still official policy, or whether their sacrifices served any purpose. The famous Mongol mobility came at a terrible cost in human suffering. Moving fast meant leaving behind the wounded, the sick, and the exhausted. Warriors who couldn't keep up were abandoned to die alone in hostile territory. The Mongol military machine prioritized speed and efficiency over human compassion, treating individual warriors as replaceable components rather than people. So when you imagine Mongol horse archers, don't picture romantic nomad warriors riding free across endless grasslands. Picture desperate men trapped in a military system that consumed their lives, dying far from home in service to an empire that viewed them as expendable tools in a vast machine of conquest. Let's move from the windswept steppes to the cramped scriptoriums of medieval Europe, where scribes spent their lives hunched over manuscripts, slowly going blind while copying texts in languages they often couldn't understand. Modern people imagine medieval scribes as learned scholars, preserving the wisdom of antiquity in beautiful illuminated manuscripts. The reality was that most scribes were essentially human photocopiers, performing mind-numbing repetitive work in terrible conditions for minimal pay, while developing crippling health problems from their occupation. The work was physically devastating. Scribes spent 12 to 16 hours a day bent over writing surfaces, gripping quill pens with cramped fingers while straining to see in poor light. The constant hunched posture caused severe back problems, neck pain, and spinal deformities. Many scribes developed permanent curvature of the spine from years of leaning over their work. Eye strain was inevitable and progressive. Medieval scriptoriums had minimal artificial lighting, usually just candles or oil lamps that produced dim, flickering light. Scribes had to work during daylight hours when possible, but winter days were short, and summer heat made concentrated work almost unbearable. Many scribes were functionally blind by their 40s, their careers effectively ended by failing eyesight. The materials were expensive, difficult to work with, and frequently ruined by accidents. Parchment was made from animal skins through a complex, smelly process that produced sheets of varying quality. A single mistake could ruin hours of work and waste precious materials that cost more than most people earned in months. Scribes who made too many errors could find themselves financially liable for the cost of replacement materials. Ink was another constant problem. Medieval ink was made from oak galls, iron, and other ingredients that were mixed by hand. The consistency was unpredictable. The colour could vary significantly, and the mixture would often separate or clot. Scribes spent considerable time preparing their own ink, and a bad batch could ruin an entire project. Quill pens required constant maintenance and replacement. Each pen had to be carefully cut and shaped for optimal performance, but the point would wear down quickly with use. Scribes spent much of their day sharpening and replacing quills, interrupting their workflow and adding to their frustration. In winter, cold fingers made it difficult to grip pens properly, leading to more mistakes and hand cramps. The texts themselves were often incomprehensible to the scribes copying them. Many manuscripts were in Latin, Greek, or other languages that scribes didn't understand. They were copying letter by letter without comprehending the meaning, making it difficult to catch errors or understand context. This mechanical copying led to numerous mistakes that were then propagated through subsequent copies. Working conditions were miserable. Scriptoriums were usually cold, damp rooms with minimal heating. In winter, scribes worked with numb fingers in rooms where their breath was visible. In summer, the same rooms became stifling hot boxes where sweat would drip onto precious manuscripts. Windows were small to prevent drafts that could scatter papers, making the rooms dark and stuffy. The pay was terrible relative to the skill and education required. Scribes needed to be literate in multiple languages, have excellent handwriting, and possess the artistic skills necessary for illumination and decoration. Despite these requirements, they were paid little more than common labourers. Many scribes lived in poverty, unable to afford decent food, clothing, or housing, despite their specialised knowledge. Monastic scribes had additional burdens. They were expected to participate in religious services multiple times per day, interrupting their work and making it difficult to maintain concentration. Prayer schedules didn't accommodate the natural rhythms of manuscript production, forcing scribes to start and stop their work at inconvenient times. The pressure to avoid errors was enormous. Religious manuscripts had to be perfect, since errors could be seen as disrespectful to God or could propagate theological mistakes. Secular texts commissioned by wealthy patrons had to meet exacting standards, or payment could be withheld. A single significant error could result in starting an entire project over from the beginning. Collaboration was difficult and often frustrating. Large manuscripts required multiple scribes working on different sections, coordinating handwriting styles, maintaining consistent formatting, and ensuring that different sections fit together properly required constant communication and revision. Personality conflicts between scribes could sabotage entire projects. The copying process was incredibly slow. An experienced scribe might complete 2 or 3 pages per day under ideal conditions. A large manuscript could take months or years to complete. During this time, scribes had to maintain their focus and motivation while working on the same document, often becoming bored and careless as the project dragged on. Illumination and decoration required additional specialized skills that many scribes lacked. Creating beautiful initial letters, border decorations, and miniature paintings required artistic talent, expensive pigments, and considerable time. Scribes who couldn't do this work were limited to plain text copying, which was less prestigious and lower paid. Health problems were universal among career scribes. In addition to back problems and eye strain, scribes suffered from repetitive stress injuries in their hands and wrists. Arthritis was common, making it painful to grip writing instruments. Many scribes developed chronic headaches from squinting in poor light and hunching over their work. The social status was paradoxical. Scribes were educated and performed important work, but they were still essentially craftsmen rather than scholars. They were looked down upon by true intellectuals while being envied by illiterate labourers. This left them in an awkward social position where they belonged to neither the scholarly elite nor the working class. Secular scribes faced additional uncertainties. Unlike monks who had guaranteed food and shelter, secular scribes depended on finding clients willing to commission manuscripts. Work could be sporadic, and scribes might go months without income while searching for their next project. Competition was fierce, and established scribes jealously guarded their relationships with wealthy patrons. The rise of universities created new opportunities, but also new pressures. Student scribes could earn money copying texts for their fellow students, but this work was often rushed and poorly paid. Academic texts had to be accurate and legible, but students were more concerned with cost than quality, forcing scribes to work quickly for minimal compensation. Women who worked as scribes faced additional discrimination and lower pay. Female scribes were often confined to convents, where they copied religious texts under strict supervision. Secular female scribes were rare and usually worked for wealthy families as private employees rather than independent contractors. The advent of paper in the later medieval period initially seemed like an improvement over parchment. Paper was cheaper and more readily available, but it was also less durable and more prone to damage from moisture and handling. Scribes had to adjust their techniques for the new material, and many of their works, on paper, have not survived, as well as parchment manuscripts. Errors were inevitable despite the scribe's best efforts. Tired eyes, cramped hands, and poor lighting led to mistakes that could change the meaning of important texts. Some errors were obvious and could be corrected, but others were subtle and were copied by subsequent scribes, creating corrupt versions of important works. The psychological toll was severe. The isolation, repetitive work, and constant pressure to avoid mistakes created stress-related disorders among many scribes. Some developed obsessive-compulsive behaviours, checking and rechecking their work endlessly. Others became depressed and withdrawn, losing interest in the intellectual content of the texts they were copying. Training new scribes was a lengthy and expensive process. Master scribes had to spend years teaching apprentices proper letter formation, layout techniques, and decoration skills. During this training period, apprentices produced work that was often unusable, representing a significant investment of time and materials with no immediate return. The preservation of knowledge that scribes accomplished was largely accidental. They were copying texts to meet immediate demand rather than consciously preserving them for posterity. Many important works were lost because no one commissioned copies, while trivial texts survived because they were popular at the time. By the late medieval period, the profession was under threat from the development of printing technology. Scribes who had spent decades perfecting their craft found themselves competing with machines that could produce texts faster and more cheaply. Many scribes died in poverty, their specialised skills made obsolete by technological progress. So when you think of medieval scribes, don't imagine noble scholars preserving civilization's greatest works. Picture arthritic men squinting at crumbling parchments in cold, dark rooms, copying texts they couldn't understand while slowly destroying their health, one letter at a time. Let's step into the arena now and examine another profession that popular culture has completely romanticised: being a Roman gladiator. Movies and television present gladiators as heroic warriors fighting for freedom and glory. The reality was that they were slaves, criminals, and desperate volunteers who died for the entertainment of crowds that viewed them as slightly more valuable than livestock. The path to becoming a gladiator was never voluntary for most participants. The majority were slaves captured in war, criminals condemned to death, or prisoners of war whose lives had been mercifully commuted to arena service. A small number were volunteers, usually men so deep in debt or poverty that risking death for prize money seemed like their only option. Training took place in gladiator schools called ludi, which were essentially prisons with exercise yards. Gladiators were property owned by their trainers, called lannistai, who had invested money in their purchase and training. These men weren't mentors or coaches. They were businessmen who wanted to maximise their return on investment before their property died in the arena. The training was brutal and designed to break the spirit while building fighting skills. New gladiators were chained, beaten, and forced to practice combat techniques for hours every day. They were fed a high-carbohydrate diet designed to build mass and provide protection against cuts, but this diet also made them slow and sluggish. Gladiators were intentionally kept slightly overweight to prolong fights and reduce the chance of immediately fatal wounds. The different types of gladiators fought with specific weapons and armour combinations that were designed for entertainment rather than effectiveness. The Retiarius fought with a net and trident, but wore minimal armour, making him fast but vulnerable. The Mamillo wore heavy armour and fought with a sword and shield, making him slow but well protected. These matchups were designed to create interesting contrasts rather than fair fights. Life expectancy was measured in months rather than years. Even successful gladiators rarely survived more than a few fights. The famous thumbs up or thumbs down from the crowd was a real phenomenon, but the gladiator's fate was usually decided by the sponsor of the games rather than popular opinion. Killing gladiators was expensive, so they were sometimes spared, but this was an economic decision rather than mercy. Medical care was purely practical. Gladiators received treatment for wounds that might heal and allow them to fight again, but serious injuries meant death or abandonment. There were no retirement plans for disabled gladiators, and a fighter who could no longer perform was simply discarded. Some gladiator schools had physicians, but their job was to patch up property, not provide compassionate care. The living conditions were deliberately harsh. Gladiators slept in cells, often chained to prevent escape or suicide. They were fed communally and monitored constantly. Sexual contact was regulated, partly to prevent the formation of alliances that might lead to rebellion, and partly because gladiators were valuable property that shouldn't be damaged by fighting over personal relationships. Training accidents were common and often fatal. Learning to fight with unfamiliar weapons while wearing restrictive armour led to frequent injuries. Practice sessions were almost as dangerous as actual fights, since trainers pushed gladiators to their limits to prepare them for arena combat. Many gladiators died before ever fighting in public. The psychological pressure was immense. Gladiators knew they were going to die, probably soon, and probably in agony, while crowds cheered their suffering. Some became fatalistic and accepted their fate, while others became desperate and dangerous. Suicide was common, though gladiator schools took precautions to prevent it, since dead gladiators represented lost investment. The famous gladiator revolts, like the one led by Spartacus, were desperate gambles rather than planned political movements. The rebels knew they had little chance of success, but the alternative was certain death in the arena. Even successful escapees faced crucifixion if captured, making rebellion a choice between different forms of horrible death. Public fights were choreographed entertainment rather than genuine combat. Gladiators were trained to put on a show with dramatic moves and crowd-pleasing techniques that weren't necessarily the most effective fighting methods. The goal was to entertain spectators who wanted blood, drama, and spectacle rather than skilled martial arts demonstrations. The crowd's reaction could determine a gladiator's fate, but the audience wasn't interested in fairness or skill. They wanted to see blood, fear, and death. A gladiator who fought well, but didn't provide enough entertainment might be condemned despite his competence. Conversely, a gladiator who died dramatically might be celebrated even if he was a poor fighter. Women gladiators, called gladiatrices, faced additional humiliation and exploitation. They were often matched against dwarfs, animals, or each other in fights designed to titillate and shock rather than demonstrate martial skill. Female gladiators were typically slaves or condemned criminals who had no choice in their participation. The equipment was designed to create interesting fights rather than protect the combatants. Gladiator armour covered some areas, while leaving others deliberately vulnerable. Weapons were often mismatched to create tactical puzzles that would entertain the crowd. A gladiator might be given excellent armour, but a poor weapon, or vice versa. Escape was virtually impossible. Gladiator schools were heavily guarded, and the surrounding communities were paid to capture and return runaways. Even if a gladiator managed to escape the school, he was a branded slave in a society that treated fugitive slaves as criminals. There was nowhere to run and no one to help. The social status of gladiators was paradoxical. They were simultaneously despised as slaves and criminals, and celebrated as entertainers and athletes. Some successful gladiators became famous and wealthy, but they remained property and could be killed at their owner's whim. Fame didn't provide freedom or security. Religious consolation was limited. While some gladiators found comfort in various cults and mystery religions, the mainstream Roman religious system offered little hope for slaves and criminals. Gladiators often turned to foreign gods or philosophies that promised better treatment in the afterlife. But these beliefs provided cold comfort to men facing immediate death. The economics of gladiator combat were brutal. Gladiators represented significant investments in training and equipment, but they were ultimately consumable commodities. Lanistae had to balance the cost of training with the revenue from fights, and this calculation usually favoured quick turnover rather than long-term gladiator careers. Retirement was theoretically possible, but practically rare. A gladiator who survived long enough might earn his freedom, symbolised by receiving a wooden sword called a rudis. However, freed gladiators often remained associated with the arena as trainers or volunteers, since they had no other marketable skills and no place in normal Roman society. The physical toll was cumulative and devastating. Even gladiators who avoided fatal wounds accumulated injuries that would eventually cripple them. Concussions, broken bones, and muscle damage built up over time, leaving survivors as physical wrecks even if they achieved freedom. Many former gladiators died young from the long-term effects of repeated trauma. Family relationships were nearly impossible to maintain. Gladiators might be sold to schools far from their homes, and even local gladiators rarely had contact with family members. Children of gladiators usually became slaves themselves, continuing the cycle of exploitation and violence. The few gladiators who achieved wealth and fame were exceptions that proved the rule. Their success stories were used to justify the system and encourage other slaves and criminals to accept their fate. But the vast majority of gladiators died anonymous, brutal deaths that provided brief entertainment for crowds who forgot them immediately. So when you imagine Roman gladiators, forget the noble warriors fighting for honour and freedom. Picture terrified slaves and criminals, force-fed and trained like livestock, dying in rigged fights for the amusement of spectators who saw them as disposable entertainment rather than human beings. As we come to the end of tonight's journey through some of history's most misrepresented professions, I hope you're feeling appropriately drowsy and perhaps a little grateful for modern working conditions. We've explored the desperate world of Chinese assassins, the floating hell of Roman galley slavery, the toxic laboratories of medieval alchemists, the brutal campaigns of Mongol horse archers, the cramped scriptoriums of medieval scribes, and the bloody arenas where gladiators died for entertainment. The pattern is always the same. Popular culture takes these historical figures and transforms them into romantic heroes, mysterious masters, or noble warriors. But the reality is that most of these people were trapped in systems that consumed their lives, health, and humanity, while offering little hope for escape or improvement. These weren't the exceptions. These were typical experiences for millions of people throughout history. The vast majority of human beings who lived before the modern era faced lives of grinding hardship, limited opportunities, and early death. We remember the exceptions, the successful generals, the wealthy merchants, the powerful rulers, but we forget the countless ordinary people who suffered and died in obscurity. This isn't meant to depress you, but to provide perspective. Your worst Monday morning meeting is paradise, compared to rowing in a Roman galley. Your most frustrating computer problems are trivial next to a medieval scribe's battle with failing eyesight and crumbling parchment. Your most demanding boss is a saint compared to a Mongol Khan sending warriors to die in foreign lands. History isn't just a collection of exciting stories about famous people. It's the accumulated experience of billions of humans who face challenges we can barely imagine, with technology and knowledge that wouldn't fill a modern elementary school textbook. Most of them lived and died without ever appearing in any historical record, their names forgotten, their stories untold. But their suffering and sacrifice built the world we inhabit today. Every convenience we take for granted, every freedom we enjoy, every medical treatment that saves our lives exists because countless previous generations endured hardship and developed solutions one painful step at a time. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can appreciate not just the comfort of your bed, but the extraordinary historical journey that made such comfort possible. From Chinese assassins hiding in alleys, to Mongol warriors freezing on the steppes, from Roman slaves dying at their oars, to medieval scribes going blind over their manuscripts, the long chain of human experience has led to this moment of peace and rest. Sleep well, knowing that for the first time in human history, millions of people can go to bed without fearing that tomorrow might bring war, plague, famine, or slavery. It's a remarkable achievement, built on the bones of countless people whose names we'll never know, but whose struggles we should never forget. And perhaps, in your dreams, you can honour their memory by appreciating the simple miracle of a safe, warm bed and the promise of another day in a world they could never have imagined, but somehow helped to create. Good night, and sweet dreams of boring, peaceful, wonderfully ordinary modern life.